The following meditation is led by Tara Brock. To access more of my meditations or join my email list, please visit tarabrock.com. This meditation is a little bit of a different format than some you might be familiar with. First, we'll just set ourselves. You might find a comfortable way of sitting, settling. You might close your eyes. You'll find that meditation asking you a kind of repeating question, so you can explore that as we go. For now, you might start by taking a nice, full, deep breath. And with the out breath, letting go. And breathing naturally, scanning the body and noticing if there's any obvious areas of tension or tightness. And taking a few moments to just let go wherever you feel holding. Be sure to soften in the shoulders and relax the hands. And softening the belly, relaxing your heart. Can you imagine the space between your eyes? Can you imagine the space that fills the nostrils? Can you imagine and sense the space that fills the lips? Can you imagine and sense the space that fills the tongue? Can you imagine the space that fills the whole mouth? Tongue, gums, teeth, lips. Can you imagine the space that fills the brain? Letting the throat fill the neck. Can you imagine the space that fills the neck? Can you imagine the distance between your shoulders? And can you imagine and sense the space that fills the shoulders? Can you imagine the length and the volume of your arms? Can you imagine the space that fills your thumb? Can you imagine the space that fills the forefinger? And can you imagine and sense the space between the thumb and the forefinger? Can you imagine the space that fills the middle finger? Can you imagine the space that fills the ring finger? And can you imagine the space that fills the little finger, the pinky? Can you imagine the space that fills all the fingers, the space between? Can you imagine the space between the palms and the back of the hands? Can you imagine the space that fills the whole hands? Can you imagine the space that fills the heart? Can you imagine the distance between either side of the chest? Can you imagine the distance between the breastbone and the spine? Can you imagine and sense the space that fills the whole cavity of the chest? Can you imagine the distance between the sides of your waist? Can you imagine the distance between the belly button and the spine? And can you imagine the space that fills the whole abdominal cavity? Can you imagine the length and the volume of your legs? Can you imagine the space that fills the feet? Can you imagine and sense the space that fills the whole body? Can you imagine the interior space out of which all the sensations are arising? Can you imagine the space that extends out from your right side beyond the most distant stars? Can you imagine the space that extends from the left side out beyond the most distant stars? Can you imagine the space in front of you extending out beyond the most distant stars? Can you imagine the space behind you extending out beyond the most distant stars. Can you imagine the space in front of you and behind you extending out beyond the most distant stars? Below you, extending out beyond the most distant stars? And can you imagine the space above you, extending out beyond the most distant stars? And can you imagine that the vastness of outer space and the vastness of inner space are continuous space? Can you imagine that this continuous space is filled with the light of awareness? Can you imagine that this continuous awake space is the space of your being? Can you imagine that everything arises and is part of this awake space of being? Can you imagine that everything belongs? Sensations, feelings, sounds, thoughts, in this awake, boundless space of being. Can you imagine that this awake space of being holds with tenderness all that arises within it? Can you imagine resting in the space of your being? Resting and allowing whatever arises to be held with tenderness and care. Can you imagine that everything that's arising right now, sensations, feelings, sounds, thoughts, are arising like waves in the great sea of formless, tender awareness? Can you imagine that everything that's arising is witnessed, held in tenderness, like an ocean cradling the waves?